By 1870, the war was 5 years gone. But out at Dogwood Bend, the yard still looked like it belonged to somebody else. The big house sagged above the river road, paint peeled, veranda rail busted in 2 places. Below it, near a leaning oak, stood a one-room frame building with a crude sign. Freedmen's Bureau, Pine Bluff Substation. On that baked dirt yard, men waited with hats in their hands to talk about rations and contracts. Children chased each other around the well, and on a rough bench under the eaves sat Sarah Ann. She held herself very straight, palms resting on a belly so round it seemed the wood should groan beneath the weight. Her dress had been let out and re-pieced more times than anyone could count. The seams made crooked tracks over stretched brown cotton. Skin on her abdomen shone, thinned and tight as if it might split with one wrong breath. To a stranger's eye, she could have been 8 months gone. The women who had known her before the Emancipation Proclamation knew better. "That ain't no fresh baby," Aunt Liza muttered to the younger ones, keeping her voice low. "Child been walking like that since Polk was in the White House." The younger women snorted, half amused, half uneasy. "Liza, you always talkin' in presidents," one whispered. "I remember her big like that, when I was still in the quarters on Cedar Row. I done birthed 3 since then, and look at her. Same size, same dress almost." They watched as Sarah shifted, one hand braced in the small of her back. Sweat dampened her headscarf. Her face, broad and handsome, carried lines you didn't see on a 30-year-old, nor even on a woman of 40. Her eyes, though, were bright and watchful. She took in every wagon, every white face, every paper Agent Adler pulled from his leather satchel. A buggy rolled through the gate, wheels grinding ruts deeper in the dust. A thin white man in a worn black coat climbed down, brushing road grit from his trousers. Dr. Thomas Keene of Pine Bluff was not a rich planter's physician. He owed more to army tents than to town parlors. Still, he carried his bag with the quiet assurance of someone used to cutting into strangers. Adler stepped out from the doorway to meet him. "Doctor," he said, offering a hand, "appreciate your coming. We've some fever cases, a boy with a bad leg and—" his glance slid toward the bench. "And one unusual complaint." Keene followed his look and paused. Even from a distance, Sarah's body told its own story. The way the fabric rode high under her ribs, the way her feet planted wide as if to keep from tipping. He'd seen neglected pregnancies, women who hid themselves until the pains drove them half mad. But nothing quite like this. No anxious husband hovered by her side. No bundle of baby things lay at her feet. "How far along?" he asked, more to the air than to any one person. Aunt Liza laughed, once dry as broom straw. "Dr. Mann, she been far along since before my youngest had teeth. Ask your books what months turn to." Adler's jaw tightened. "You'll get your turn for rations, Liza. Let the doctor work." Inside the little mission room, the air was no cooler, only dimmer. A pine table served as examination couch. A scrap of sheet covered its rough planks. Sarah climbed onto it with slow care, not with the clumsy haste of a woman near term, but with the practiced economy of someone who had been lifting that same burden for years. "Lie back if you can," Keene said, trying for a neutral tone. She eased herself down, breathing shallowly. "How old are you, Sarah Ann?" She stared at the ceiling boards. "They said I was near 20 when Mr. Lincoln freed us. I don't know how white folks count now." "So, about 35. She shrugged one shoulder. "My back say more." He set his fingers on her wrist, pulse strong, not racing, eyes clear, no fever. He pressed lightly on the curve of her abdomen, expecting the give of muscle and fluid. Instead, his hand met something unyielding, smooth, fixed beneath the skin like a stone set under leather. "Any movement?" he asked, Kicking? Turning? Not in a long while. Her voice held no drama, only a worn certainty. Used to flutter sometimes when thunder come. Past few years, just heavy. Like carrying a rock with a memory. He listened with his stethoscope, a simple wooden tube he'd carried since the war, moving it from side to side. No tiny heart, no rush of placental blood, only the distant thud of her own. He pressed deeper, following the shape. Head? No. The mass had contours, yes, but not where they should be. When he asked her to roll slightly and palpated along the flank, something inside shifted against his fingertips with a faint, dry rasp, as if one hard surface slid over another. He pulled his hand back, unsettled. What was that? Adler asked from the doorway, trying to see. Gas, Keene said too quickly. Or adhesions. He wiped his palms on his coat. Outside, under the oak, the circle of women had grown. A younger one, cradling a nursing infant, spoke without looking up. I seen her with that same belly when they marched us past Fort Smith before the big fight. Men went off skinny and came back with white hair. She come back with the same load. Some say she carry the boss man's sin, another murmured. Some say she carry all the babies they didn't let us keep. Adler's patience finally frayed. If you ladies spent half as much time reading the contracts as you do telling tales, you'd be better off come harvest. Aunt Liza tilted her head. Paper never yet paid a widow, Mr. Adler. But we watch our own. In the cramped room, Keene closed his bag and spoke low. In my opinion, this is not a viable pregnancy. If it ever was, could be a calcified fetus, could be a tumor. Either way, it's been there far too long. She's lucky to be alive. Can you do anything? Adler asked. Not here. He glanced at the cracked window, the bare shelf with a bottle of turpentine and a stack of tracts about temperance. In Little Rock, at the charity hospital, with proper instruments perhaps, it would be an instructive operation. Instructive, Adler repeated, tasting the word. The Bureau is always asking for cases that illustrate the condition of the freed people. A report like that, in a society journal. He imagined signatures, stamps, maybe a line in some Washington circular. Keene thought of a paper under his name, citations from colleagues he'd never met. Between them, on the table, Sarah folded her hands over her belly and stared at the window, where a strip of sky showed. Y'all talking like I ain't here, she said quietly. Keene cleared his throat. We're discussing sending you to a hospital, Mrs. Sarah Ann, to take this thing out of you. It could make you more comfortable. Might save your life down the line. Her fingers tightened in the fabric of her dress. I done been sent once, she murmured. Sold off this county in a wagon, belly full, not knowing where I'd land. You say send and case. Sound the same to me. Adler stepped closer, coat rustling. This isn't chains and auction blocks, Sarah. You're free now. This is for your benefit. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Free women still get carried off when white folks got plans. Outside, a gust lifted red dust against the mission wall. On the bench where she'd been sitting, the hollow her weight left seemed deeper than the wood itself. Keene looked from her rigid profile to the unnatural roundness under his hand. A life spent with that mass inside her, through whipping seasons, through rumors of freedom, through blue uniforms and new debts. I can't promise you much, he said at last, only that what's in there is not a child that's going to be born in any ordinary way. It's time somebody saw it. Sarah turned her head then, met his eyes with a gaze that had watched too many men decide things. You go on and look then, she answered. Just remember, it got there when I didn't have a say. Don't let it leave me that way, too. Adler was already reaching for his forms, mind on requisitions, dates, attestations. On his paper, the first line he wrote was not Sarah Ann, woman, but unusual abdominal case suitable for surgical investigation. Before anyone called her Sarah Ann, they called her Sally and whistled for her like for a dog. Cedar Row sat close to the Arkansas River, low fields slipping down toward the water, the big house on a rise where the breeze reached the gallery. Sally slept not up there, but in the service room behind the kitchen, on a pallet that smelled of lard, smoke, and other people's meals. She was 16 the first time the overseer closed the door with the heel of his boot. Afterward, she washed herself at the pump in the dark, arms shaking from cold and rage. Old Mabel, the midwife, watched the way Sally held her stomach and did not ask too many questions. On that place, everyone knew where babies came from. Nobody said out loud whose face they might carry. The first signs were the same as for any woman: morning bile, dizziness, a softness in the breasts. Mabel felt her belly one afternoon by the woodpile and nodded once. "Something settling in there," she said. "You eat when I tell you. You lie down when I say. You hear?" Sally wanted to say, "I didn't ask for this." She said nothing. By harvest, the overseer had lost interest. His eyes moved on to another girl. Colonel Whitcomb barely glanced her way, but his wife did. Mrs. Whitcomb watched Sally as she brought in plates, gaze traveling to the swelling under her apron, face tightening like a rope being pulled. "You'll not shame my table with that," she hissed one evening in the pantry. "Do your work and keep your eyes down. If that thing is seen, you'll answer for it." The months rolled, measured by cotton weights and river levels. Inside her, the child grew. Even Sally, who tried to feel nothing, could not ignore the kicks, the tumbling turns at night. Sometimes she pressed both hands to her skin and whispered, "I don't know you." Yet she knew the rhythm of its movement better than any song. It should have ended in blood and cries and a wet, new wail. Instead, it ended on a staircase. One stormy night the house clattered with shouting. A younger kitchen girl dropped a tray in the hall. China broke, gravy splashed. The overseer spun on her, arm raised. Sally, heavy and slow, stepped between, taking the blow full in the middle of her body. Pain shot through her like heat from a stove. She staggered, heel sliding on the grease-slick board. The world lurched. She felt herself falling, hands grabbing for the rail, belly smashing wooden edge, then nothing but a roar in her ears as she tumbled down. She woke on the floor with old Mabel's lap under her head and voices buzzing. "Water! Rags! Get her skirt off!" Cramps wrung her from inside, waves of agony, then shivering cold. She bled, but not the way Mabel expected. No gush that heralded a child. Hours went by with groaning and sweat and whispers of psalms, and still no infant, living or dead. "Push, girl," Mabel commanded, until her voice broke. "I am," Sally gasped. "Ain't nothing comin'." By dawn, the pain changed. The sharp tearing subsided into a thick, numbing weight. The bleeding slowed. Her belly, instead of emptying, sat on her like a stone set upon her gut, smaller than before, but still wrong. Mabel's hands trembled as she probed gently. "It gone hard," she murmured, "like it turnin' to rock." "That mean it over?" Sally whispered. "Over for now." Mabel crossed herself in the way she'd brought from the coast of Africa. Sometimes the body seal up a bad thing. Sometimes the Lord hide what man done. Colonel Whitcomb came down from the main house in a coat thrown over his nightshirt, face sour from lost sleep. "Well?" he demanded. "Is the nuisance finished?" Mabel straightened, wiped her hands on her apron. "Baby ain't here, sir." "Then it's dead." He looked at Sally with the same expression he might give a lame mule. See that she's back on her feet before ginning starts. And if anybody asks, the brat never drew breath. I don't want gossip traveling upriver. Mrs. Whitcomb arrived later, hair neatly recoiled, fury wrapped in lace. What did you think would happen? She said softly, leaning close so only Sally could hear. You play around what belongs to your betters. God punishes. Let this be a lesson. You may wear that belly the rest of your days for what you did. Sally's lips parted. No words came. The room seemed to tilt. She knew very well what she had and had not chosen, but the accusation stuck like a thorn. Weeks crawled. Fever came and went. For a time they thought she would die. Her skin burned, then chilled. Her mind drifted. Once she woke to find Mabel pressing a wet cloth to her chest and humming a tune older than the plantation. I see 'em sometimes, Mabel whispered, thinking Sally still half gone. Babies that don't get born proper. Some dry up, some hide. Yours sittin' between worlds. Slowly Sally's strength crept back. She could stand, carry a bucket, sweep. Yet her middle never flattened. It settled into a smaller, fixed swell, high and unyielding. When she dropped something and bent, a sharp stab shot through her side as that hard mass shifted slightly, like a weight hung inside her on a short rope. Her courses never returned. When she walked past the cabins, women's eyes dropped instinctively to her shape, then away. Baby died, they told newcomers in low tones, but ground never got it. Sometimes, when thunder rolled over the river, Sally felt a faint internal flutter. Not quite pain, not quite movement. It was gone as soon as she tried to catch it. Years slid over the place. Children were born and sold. Men were whipped and disappeared. The overseer took other girls into back rooms. Whitcomb bought and traded bodies like hogs. Through it all, Sally hauled water, scrubbed floors, carried platters to the dining room, with that same unnatural curve under her dress, neither pregnant nor not. When one of the younger women came up expecting, the mistress would summon Sally to stand beside her in the yard. You look at her. Mrs. Whitcomb would say sharply, you see what happens to wickedness. You keep yourselves clean, or you'll end like that. The younger ones would nod, though they all knew who owned whose nights. To them, Sally became a walking warning and something else besides. Around the cook fire, in the low talk just before sleep, they used other words. She keepin' a white man's sin where it can't be seen, someone would murmur. Nah, Mabel would answer, staring into the embers. She holdin' more than his. She holdin' all the times. They split us from what we carried. By the time blue uniforms began to appear along the river, the war sounding in distant thunder, Sally's belly had long since stopped changing. The world outside shifted. Flags, orders, rumors of freedom. But inside her, that stone presence remained. When Cedar Row was finally broken up and bodies counted and priced, she was loaded into a trader's wagon with the rest, that old burden still riding under her ribs. The bill of sale listed female, prime age, sound, with no mention of the 20-year wait no one had ever seen. By the time people started calling her Sarah Ann instead of Sally, the war was over on paper. But the fields along the Arkansas still wanted the same backs. Dogwood Bend had a new owner, whose name didn't matter much. The cabins stayed where they were. The furrows cut the same lines. The difference was in the ink on contracts tacked up at the Freedmen's Bureau office in Pine Bluff. Men who had been sold now signed their names with crooked X's. Women stepped out of slave rolls and into ledgers of laborers. Sarah signed nothing. She just stood there, stomach pushing against her faded dress, listening while someone else read aloud terms for land she would hoe, but never own. The story of her body traveled faster than any official notice. Women whisper faster than weavers. Young wives came to her doorway with hands on their own flat bellies. "Auntie Sarah, you carried once. What you do for the sickness in the mornin'?" She wanted to say, "I never carried. Not the way you mean." Instead, she told them what old Mabel had taught her. Ginger and water, crackers when the sun first touched the window, breath through the cramp. They watched that curve under her dress and thought, this is a woman who knows how it feels. None of them had ever seen her with a child in her arms. When a small government wagon finally rattled up the sandy lane in 66, people came out to watch. The flag on the side marked it Bureau Business. A thin white man in a worn jacket, with a leather case of vials and a roll of papers, climbed down and shook hands with the new local agent. "That Doyle," somebody muttered. "Come to stick needles in folks." They were there to vaccinate, to check rations, to count freed people like fence posts. Doyle worked through the line briskly, sleeves rolled, wiping, pricking, moving on. Then his gaze snagged on Sarah. "How far along is she?" he asked. The agent frowned. "They say she'd been that way since before Vicksburg." Doyle's face changed, only for a heartbeat. "Ma'am," he said, schooling his tone into professional courtesy, "would you allow me a look? Strictly for your health." She followed him into the single-room office, boards still smelling of fresh-cut pine. He tapped her abdomen, pressed gently, listened with his ear to her skin. "No movement?" he asked. "Not lately," she answered. "Sometimes used to shimmy. Now it just sits." He nodded, mouth tight. "Hard mass. No fetal sounds. No sign of wasting otherwise." He scribbled in his notebook, the pen scratching. "Colored woman. Age about 30. Abdominal enlargement of long duration. Likely calcified product of old conception or tumor. Advised removal to City Hospital for examination." Out loud he said, "There's a hospital in Little Rock. Surgeons there could investigate. Might ease your discomfort. Might even save your life." She looked past him, out the doorway, to where the fields ran off toward the tree line. "How they get me there?" she asked. "In a wagon. We'd arrange. I'd unrode enough wagons that weren't mine," she cut in quietly. "Last time they took me, they didn't ask what I wanted. I ain't aimed to climb in again, lest my feet walk me." He tried reason. He tried a softer voice. In the end, he wrote "declined" in a small, irritated hand and underlined it twice. On Sundays, the gossip moved from lane to pew. New Hope Baptist was a low building with plank benches and a pulpit made from an old packing crate. Reverend Caleb Johnson had once been property. Now he preached with a battered Bible and a voice that shook dust from the rafters. One evening they held a service for women who had lost infants during the war years. Babies born too soon, babies starved, babies buried without markers. Candles flickered in tin holders along the walls. "Bring your grief," Caleb said. "Lay it where the Lord can see it." Women stepped forward in twos and threes, eyes wet, hands shaking. Sarah stayed in the back, near the door. But when the singing swelled, low harmonies, humming more than words, something twisted inside her in a way it had not in years. It wasn't the old, dull ache. It was a small turn, like a joint being eased after long rust. She grabbed the bench in front of her, breath catching. At that same moment, 3 women in the front row doubled over with a different kind of pain, sharp, low, like a contraction. One let out a soft cry, then laughed through tears. I felt something move, she whispered to the woman beside her. Doctor told me I'd never quicken again. Later, in yards and over washtubs, they compared stories. When preacher prayed for our lost babies, I swear I felt a flutter, one said. Me too, another answered. Like little feet remembering the way. And where was Sarah standing? Aunt Liza asked. They all knew. Far away, on a desk in Pine Bluff, Dr. Keene uncapped his ink and began a letter on good paper. To the Arkansas Medical Society. I wish to report what appears to be a rare example of lithopedion found among the colored population in Jefferson County. He laid out the facts as he chose to see them. A young enslaved woman once pregnant, no delivery, persistent abdominal mass, 2 decades duration. He mentioned native superstition about a child turned to stone. He suggested that such cases illustrate the consequences of inadequate obstetric attention among the former slave class. He did not write rape. He did not write fall on the stairs under an overseer's hand. Those words stayed in the room of his mind, labeled complications of the peculiar institution, and never made it to the page. Months later, in a cramped office in Little Rock, a man in spectacles read Keene's letter, pursed his lips, and slid it into a thin folder marked Curiosities instead of sending it to the printer. No journal article appeared, no wider debate about what it meant for a woman's body to hold on to a wrong that long. Back on Dogwood Bend, Sarah's name went unprinted, but her presence did its own kind of publishing. Girls whispered of her when their own bellies started to swell. Older women touched her arm before going to the graveyard, as if some of what she carried might help them leave their losses behind. One summer night, years after Appomattox, she sat on her stoop alone, the sound of frogs from the bayou rising and falling. The weight under her ribs lay unusually still. No drag when she shifted, no grind when she turned. For the first time she could remember, her own breathing was the only motion she felt. She laid both hands over that long, familiar mound and thought, either you're finally dead or you're waiting on something else. Out in the dark, a whip-poor-will called once and fell silent, as if holding its answer for another year. By the following spring, the quiet inside her had turned from relief into something that felt like a warning. First, it was Aunt Liza who noticed. Sarah bent to lift a sack in the yard and straightened all the way without the usual pause, without the hiss of pain that had become part of her breath. "You movin' light," Liza murmured, watching the way the dress no longer stretched quite so tight. Either that thing giving up, or it fixin' to do something. A week later, Keene's buggy showed up again at Dogwood Bend, dust blooming around the wheels. The bureau agent met him halfway down the lane, letter in hand. "She says that lump's gone quiet," Doyle's old note had said. "If we are to act, now is the time." They called Sarah to the yard like they had once called people to the auction block, except now there was no platform, only the open sky and a cluster of eyes. Keene asked her the questions he already knew the answers to. "No bleed?" "Not in years." "Any strain? Fever?" "No, sir," she said, though she had woken some nights drenched and shaking, heart racing as if she had run across the county. He laid his hand against the curve of her abdomen, pressing, listening for any faint drum of life. All he found was solid resistance, as if bone had learned to behave like stone. "There is risk either way," he said, looking from her to the agent. "If we do nothing, it may rot inside her, poison the blood. If we operate—" He did not finish. The agent folded his arms. "We can get her on a wagon to Little Rock. Hospital there, trained men. Bureau will cover the cost. Might show Washington we're tending our people. Their people. Her body. Different meanings in the same air." Sarah stood in that little ring of men and women and remembered the last time someone had said, "We'll take you where there's more care." That road had ended with a new name on a slave list. "You askin' me," she said slowly, "or tellin' me?" Keene hesitated, then tried a softer tone. "I am asking, but I would not advise waiting longer." Liza touched her elbow. Child, she whispered, though Sarah was no child. You've been walking with that thing since I had black hair. Maybe time to see what it is. That night, lying on her pallet, Sarah stared at the shadows on the ceiling. Under her palms, the old weight sat there, stubborn and unfamiliar at once. She thought of the young girls who now came to her for remedies, of the women who had leaned on her shoulder after burying infants. If I go, she thought, I go for more than myself. She climbed into the bureau wagon at dawn. The trip to Little Rock jounced her bones and numbed her legs. Fields slid by, then scattered houses, then streets with real sidewalks. The hospital loomed like a stern brick ship, windows glinting. Inside, the air smelled of carbolic acid and boiled linens, sharp enough to sting her nose. They took her name, turned Sally into Sarah Ann Whitcomb, colored female. Gave her a thin gown and a narrow bed, in a ward where lame soldiers muttered in their sleep. A young woman with dark skin tied up in a white cap brought her water and helped her settle. I'm Maddie, the woman said. You call if you need something. Later that afternoon, Maddie wheeled her into a high room with benches rising in rows. Lamps hung from iron arms overhead, catching on metal instruments laid out on a table. A dozen white men in coats turned as she entered, notebooks ready. Dr. Wilcox, a tall man with a clipped beard, addressed the room as if she were not present. Female, colored, mid-30s by estimation, he recited. History suggests intra-abdominal calcified pregnancy of roughly 2 decades. Gentlemen, we rarely see such longevity. He nodded for Maddie to uncover her. Cold air licked her skin as the sheet dropped from her belly. Wilcox traced the outline with his hand, not roughly, but without any sense that it belonged to her. You will note the firmness, he said. No sign of active gestation. We anticipate either a petrified fetus or a large fibroid. A student near the back raised his hand. Sir, what does the woman herself believe she carries? Wilcox's jaw tightened. She believes what anyone in her circumstance might, given lack of education. We are here to replace speculation with evidence. Sarah watched their faces, their neat collars and ink-stained fingers. They discussed her like weather. That evening, after they wheeled her back, Maddie sat on the edge of the bed and held a tin cup while Sarah drank. They talk like you ain't in the room, Maddie muttered. Sarah gave a small, weary smile. Been listening to folks talk over me my whole life. Tomorrow, they'll give you medicine, make you sleep, Maddie said. They say you won't feel it. Sarah let her hand drift to the mound beneath the thin cotton. I done felt it for a long time already, she whispered. Sleep came in snatches. When it took her, it brought strange pictures. A small hand reaching up through dark water, a staircase lit by lamplight, and a heavy boot coming down, a bundle in her arms that weighed nothing and everything at once. Voices, women's voices, murmuring all around, not accusing, not forgiving, just there. Far away, back on Dogwood Bend, Aunt Liza startled awake before dawn, heart pounding, with the sense that someone she loved was walking toward a door she could not see. In the gray morning, Maddie came with a hooded glass bottle and a scrap of rag soaked in sweet, sharp fumes. They ready for you? She said, voice low. You listen to me now. She leaned close so only Sarah could hear. What they about to cut out been laid on you by more than one man and more than one law. Whatever they find, it don't belong just to you. Sarah nodded once. When Maddie pressed the cloth over her nose, the ceiling swung gently. The last thing she saw was the doorway filling with white coats and the glint of steel, and Maddie's dark eyes above the mask, steady as if she meant to hold on to a part of Sarah no blade could reach. They rolled her under the lamps, while the ether was still fogging her thoughts. Maddie walked beside the stretcher, one hand on the rail, the other on Sarah's wrist. In the white glare of the operating room, everything looked hard. The metal basin, the glass bottles, the faces above the masks. Dr. Wilcox glanced at the clock. "Let's proceed. Give her a bit more." The sweet rag hovered over Sarah's nose. Sound slid away, leaving only a slow, distant pounding. She felt hands move her, cloth lifted, skin bared. A line of cold traced across her belly, where someone scrubbed with alcohol. The ceiling swam, then steadied in a tight circle of light. "Incision," Wilcox said. Steel bit through scarred flesh. Maddie watched the first rush of red catch on gauze, watched muscles open like pages. She had stood through amputations and bullet removals, but this cut felt different. It went through more than one life. "Deeper," Wilcox murmured. "Careful. There's our capsule." The blade reached something that did not give living tissue. His fingertips found a curve that resisted. The room leaned in. "Extra retractors. We're around it now." They widened the opening by inches. What emerged did not look like any birth Maddie had ever seen. It came slowly, scraping against bone, wrapped in a dull gray membrane. For a moment it lodged, then gave with a gritty sound that went through Maddie's teeth. Wilcox lifted it with both hands. It filled his palms, heavy, ovoid, surface chalky and yellowed. "Gentlemen," he said, voice almost pleased. "This appears to be a classic petrified fetus. Note the outline of skull." He turned it slightly. Beneath the crust, shape suggested a face pressed inward on itself, sockets with no eyes, a ridge where a nose had been, jaw fused into the chest. Limbs had curled in, bone over bone, until they became part of the mass. One of the younger men stepped back, swallowing hard. Another leaned closer, morbid curiosity winning over queasiness. Maddie saw what the men named and what they did not. Tiny arm bones fused together, crooked as if they had reached and never stopped reaching. Ribs welded into a single plate. No space left for breath. Behind them, the bureau agent stared with a kind of grim fascination, as though this object might, if properly described, justify a line in some report about conditions among the freed. "Place it here," Wilcox said. "We'll examine in detail later." He nodded toward a waiting glass jar, half full of clear liquid. "But there's more," Keene said quietly, peering into the cavity. "Here, on the right." Wilcox bent again. His gloved fingers found another shape, softer, irregular. Secondary mass. He dissected it free. This one tore more easily, yielding a wet, dull sound. When he slit the sack, its contents spilled into the tray. Scattered bits of calcified tissue, fragments of vertebrae, and long bones that had never learned their proper pattern. "A second conception," one student whispered. "Or an incomplete twin," another offered. "Or remnants of earlier loss," Keene said, his voice low. Wilcox shrugged, already fitting words into a future paragraph. "Multiplicity is not uncommon. We'll classify after measurement." As he spoke, Sarah's body jerked beneath the straps. Just once. A tremor ran from her shoulders to her feet. The ether mask slipped. Maddie grabbed it and pressed it back, murmuring without thinking, "Hush, Miss Sarah. They almost done." Far away, in the clapboard church at Dogwood Bend, a hymn was rising. Women swayed on the rough benches, eyes closed, hands open. Mid-song, Sister Ruth doubled over, clutching her belly, though she had been barren since the lash tore her back. Beside her, another woman clamped a hand over her mouth as something fluttered low and deep, where for years there had been nothing but ache. "Lord," the pastor stammered, losing his place. Lord, you movin' among us. By year's end, folks would remark how many babies came crying into that settlement, to mothers long past the age anyone expected. No one in Little Rock would hear their names. In Dogwood Bend, old women would lower their voices and say, "She finally let them go." Back in the operating room, the worst of the cutting was over. Wilcox checked for bleeding, packed sponges, began to close the layers he had parted. "Pulse?" he asked. "Thin," Maddie answered, fingers on Sarah's wrist. "But there. Very good. The danger now is shock and infection. We've taken quite a load out of her." He did not say what kind of load. On a side table, the hard fetus lay in its bath of preservative, pale outline distorted by the fluid. The smaller fragments floated in a second jar, like a handful of stones dropped into a clear pond. "Label those," Wilcox told a student. "Number, date, description. One jar for the petrified specimen, one for the associated remains." The young man dipped his pen, wrote on 2 tags, tied them to the glass with practiced indifference. Maddie, wiping blood from Sarah's flank, watched him form the letters. On both slips, under origin, he scrawled simply, "Colored woman, Arkansas." No name, no story. Just the kind of line that could sit in a catalog for a century, without anyone asking who had carried that weight down rows of cotton. When they wheeled Sarah out, her face was gray under the bandage, but her chest rose and fell. Maddie walked with her again, hand on the rail. She glanced back once. The jars already sat on a shelf among skulls and bones, identical labels facing out. Under her breath, where only the clink of instruments could hear, she said, "They couldn't take your breath, so they took what they could pickle. They stole the part you never got to hold." And as the doors swung closed, the cloudy glass caught the light in a way that made the twisted relic inside look, for just an instant, like it was curling toward the warmth and then forgetting how. For weeks afterward, people on Dogwood Bend watched Sarah walk, as if they were seeing someone reborn into a body they didn't quite recognize. She moved carefully at first, one palm pressed to the neat row of stitches beneath her dress. The swelling went down. She learned how it felt to bend without that old weight blocking her, to sleep on her side without feeling something grind inside, to carry a pail of water and not hear that faint inner scrape that had been with her since she was a girl. The freedom in her step came with another kind of emptiness. At night, lying on a narrow pallet, she would reach for the curve that had defined her outline for 2 decades and find only the flat rise of scar and muscle. No stone, no stirring, just herself. "Do you miss it?" Maddie asked once, visiting from Little Rock, hands roughened by soap and lye. Sarah stared at the lamp flame a long moment. "I don't miss the hurt," she answered. "But I don't rightly know who I am without carrying what they left in me." Information about what the surgeons had taken traveled much faster than any news of how Sarah felt. In Arkansas Medical College, the jars became items in a register. A clerk with neat script entered them in a long book. No. 47, Lithopedion, Negro female, Arkansas, approx. 20 years duration, donated by Dr. H.C. Wilcox. No mention of a house on Cedar Row. No mention of a fall on the stairs or a man whose name no one dared to write. When Wilcox finally submitted his paper, the printed page looked clean and authoritative. He laid out the measurements, length, circumference, estimated gestational age. He described a colored woman of limited intelligence who presented with a long-standing abdominal mass. A paragraph on primitive obstetric practices and superstitious reluctance to seek early care rounded out the discussion. The journal did not print the part where she had been forced, as a teenager, into an arrangement she could not refuse. He had not written that in the first place. Decades later, the jars gathered dust in a glass-fronted cabinet. Students memorized their catalog numbers for examinations, then forgot them. When the anatomy collection was moved in the mid-20th century, someone noted that one specimen listed in the ledger could not be located. Item presumed discarded during earlier reorganization, an administrator scribbled in the margin. A life dissolved into a sentence about shelving. On the other side of that century, a different pair of hands unrolled microfilm in the state archives. The hum of the reader was the only sound in the room as a young historian leaned closer, adjusting the focus until the letters came into view. Lithopedion in a Negro woman, Arkansas, the heading read. He traced the lines with his eyes, then set that reel aside and opened another drawer marked Federal Writers Project. In a typewritten interview from the 1930s, he found an old woman's voice captured in uneven spelling. She was big with it, long as I can 'member. They say white man's baby turned to stone inside her, 'cause sin got no place to be born. De Hoyo, historian, sat back. Two very different records describing the same body. In one, she was a case. In the other, a vessel for a whole community's loss. Years later, speaking into a microphone for an audience he could not see, he laid those fragments side by side. He described the condition in plain medical terms, so no one would accuse him of inventing it. He read a line from the article, then a line from the old woman's story, and asked the listeners which seemed closer to truth. After that episode went out, an envelope arrived from Arkansas. Cream paper, careful handwriting. Inside was a letter from a woman in her 70s. My grandmama, it said, used to talk about a kinfolk's woman who carried a rock in her belly till they cut it out in Little Rock. She said that after they did, babies started coming again in our people. When I heard your telling, it sounded like her story. She always told us, we from the line of the one who carried what wasn't hers. At the bottom, in a smaller hand, another line. Sometimes when my hips ache, I wonder what I'm still holding that belonged to somebody else. The archivists at the medical school never did find the missing jar. Its number still sits in the catalog between other entries, like a skipped beat. In churchyards up and down the Arkansas River, the names of children born in the 1870s have worn thin on their stones, but they are still there if you lean close. So when we talk about Sarah Ann now, we can say with confidence there was a woman in bondage who became pregnant and never gave birth in the way anyone expected. We can say a surgeon, years later, removed a calcified fetus and bits of other bone. Those things fit comfortably in the language of pathology. The rest sits between lines. 20 years of walking under a burden that began as someone else's choice, a cluster of births that followed her cutting open, a family that still measures itself against a story of a girl turned into a storage place for another man's wrongdoing. Somewhere, on a back shelf or in the red dirt, the stone that everyone stared at has crumbled, or lies mislabeled, or was ground under a new foundation. But the weight she carried did not vanish with the specimen. It moved, as such things do, into memory and bone, and stories told on porches at dusk. You can throw away a jar. You cannot, so easily, throw away what it proved was done to a body that had no say.